working up against the
Getting vaccines, right? Yeah, so that happens. My name is Evan Weiner, and I'm going to do a talk about the year 1915. Probably impacted your parents or your grandparents, but it had an impact on you. And some of the things that happened in 1915 still resonate 109 years later. We're still talking about some of the same issues 109 years later. Now, this was the Great War. It wasn't World War I yet. It was just the Great War, and this is a poster from England. It's far better to face the bullets than to be killed at home by a bomb. Join the army at once and help stop an air raid. God save the Queen. Now, this
So
was
they were
also
talking about A-bombs in 1915?
bomb, not an A-bomb, but bombs,
A-bomb.
just bombs.
Okay, a bomb.
Okay, A-bomb.
Okay.
D.W. Griffiths, the Klansman, Birth of a Nation, which led to a Ku Klux Klan revival in the United States. The Great White Hope, Jack Johnson was the boxing champion of the world. He was colored. And the authorities, anybody, the boxing authorities, even the government, was looking to knock him off. They did not want Jack Johnson as a heavyweight boxing champion of the world. And finally, the Great White Hope in 1915 was Jess Willard, and he won the championship. Free speech. Emma Goldman is talking about birth control and is arrested. She's arrested for talking about birth control. The National Birth Control League starts in 1915. Women want to vote. They really want to vote in the United States. They're not voting in the United States, but they do get the vote in Denmark. Brilliant army of women in white, Fifth Avenue parade for the vote. The New York World, which lasted kind of until about 1965 in a way with the World Journal Tribune. Keep immigrants out. Keep immigrants out. 1915, 1914, 15, 16, 17. The politicians want to keep immigrants out, particularly those from Eastern Europe. Archduke Ferdinand. The war starts in 1914. And Archduke Ferdinand is assassinated in 1914. And mamas, don't let your sons grow up to be archdukes or emperors or anything like that. Back in the 1860s, in the Mexican-French War, Napoleon III said to Maximilian, "How'd you like to be the emperor of Mexico, in addition to Austria-Hungary?" He said, "Sure." Well, that didn't work out too well for him. Mexico would eventually beat France in the war, and poor Maximilian, he's executed. And this guy, too, is going to be executed. Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife are assassinated by a gunman during a drive through Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. He's told, "Franz, don't go. They're going to kill you. They want to kill you." Who wants to kill me? This group called the Black Hand. What are they going to do? I didn't do anything to them. Well, they're a Serbian group, and they're very upset. They're very upset at Austria-Hungary because they said their homeland, Serbia, was annexed by Austria-Hungary in 1908. No big deal. And his wife said, "Sophie, maybe we shouldn't go there." "What do you mean?" "Well, maybe we could go a different time of year, like winter. You know, they may hold the Olympics eventually in Sarajevo. That's a good place, right?" And nothing is going to happen to me. So on June 28th rather, which was the day of Serbia's national day, Serbia is celebrating. He goes to Sarajevo. And him going to Sarajevo means that he is about ready to get assassinated, and he and Sophie are assassinated. The assassination traced back to the extremist group, Black Hand, that wanted to increase Serbian power in the Balkans by breaking up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. World War I is also known as the Great War. Starts on July 28, 1914. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. And the peace that was holding together all of Europe falls apart. Countries decide to go to war against each other, like Russia and Belgium and France and Great Britain and Serbia, all on the same side, and they line up against Austria-Hungary and Germany, and the Great War starts. The Austro-Hungarian Empire attacked Serbia, and Germany supported Austria-Hungary and Russia. They sided with their traditional ally, Serbia. So Woodrow Wilson is in the United States, President of the United States. He's been in office since March of 1913, so he's been there for about a year and a half, a little less than a year and a half, and he's got to make a decision. Who are we supporting? Are we supporting anyone? America is watching. That is what they're doing. America is watching. At the outbreak of fighting, the United States remained on the sidelines, adopting a policy of neutrality, which was favored by Wilson. And Wilson does not want to give up the trade with all of Europe. And so he's going to continue trading with and shipping as well, with both sides of the conflict. On August the 4th, 1914, Wilson declared that the United States would remain impartial in thought as well as in action. On February 5th, 1915, the Germans declare a submarine blockade of Britain. Any ship approaching the British coast is considered to be a legitimate target. On March 11th, in an attempt to stave the enemy into submission, Britain announces a blockade of German ports. Neutral ships headed for Germany are to be escorted to Allied ports and detained. On March 11th, the British steamship RMS Falaba becomes the first passenger ship to be sunk by German U-boats, or a German U-boat, U-28. 104 people are lost to sea, including one American passenger. I'm going to talk about ships here for a second. I used to speak on cruise ships prior to COVID-19. I spoke on Royal Caribbean, I spoke on Celebrity, also Holland America, among others. And I was on a Holland American ship one day. We're over in Europe. And a guy from Holland American, who is Holland American's historian, said, listen, well, he didn't say listen, he told an audience to listen to him about what Holland America did in World War I and World War II. And he said the ships had munitions. He said during World War I, we would be carrying from Holland to the United States people who wanted to be immigrants. During World War I as well, we used to have munitions on the ship. And everybody knew we were carrying munitions along with other ships that were sailing. We're all carrying munitions. We were helping out the Allied cause. And so the ships were fair game in this sense. Zeppelin raids. Anybody ever been on the Zeppelin? Anybody ever listened to Led Zeppelin, the rock group? Anyway, Zeppelin raids. On January 19th, the Germans began flying Zeppelin raids in England. The Zeppelins were able to fly at a higher altitude than the Defender's planes. They had been developed by Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, and they were used in the German military since 1909. The Germans targeted the coastal towns of Yarmouth and King's Lynn in January before moving on to attack London in May. It took a while before the British pilots had the skills and means to successfully defeat the incoming raids. Chemical weapons are introduced, and this would be mustard gas, among other things, troops in the trenches and all of that, and would lead to the poem Flanders Field. Trench warfare was seeing the use of poison gas. A non-lethal type of gas had been used by the Germans in late 1914, but a more damaging kind was put onto the Eastern Front in January in Wolimów, which is now in Poland, on the Eastern Front in fighting between the Germans and the Russians, where it froze. The Germans had developed chlorine gas, and that would be used at Ypres in April. It had been dispersed by air and by military fire, so they were poisoning people along with shooting them or trying to bomb them. On April 22nd, the Second Battle of Ypres begins. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, German soldiers open the valves and release almost 200 tons of chlorine gas across a 2.5 mile or 4 kilometer area. Being heavier than air, they relied on wind direction to blow the gas toward the French trenches. About 6,000 Allied troops died within 10 minutes. Canadian reinforcements improvised by covering their faces with urine-soaked scarves. The British Expeditionary Force, or the BEF, was able to counteruse the gas with their own variants. The First Lord of Admiralty, excuse me?
They killed them with what, their own?
Chlorine gas. And the way you put a scarf over your face, soaked with urine, and that saved you. So, this is Winston Churchill. How many of you have heard of Winston Churchill? Sure, during World War II, right? Well, he was the First Lord of Admiralty during World War I for England. Many in Britain, notably the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, believed that knocking the Ottomans out of the war would undermine Germany. They theorized that as a result of this attack, Britain and France would be able to help their weakest partner, Russia, that the Suez Canal and the British Middle Eastern oil interests, hey, we're talking about oil, aren't we? Aren't we talking about oil 109 years later? Saudi Arabian oil? Nothing changes, does it? Nothing changes. Anyway, Britain's Middle East oil interests, actually it was Iran or Persia at that time, would be secured, and that undecided Balkan states, including Bulgaria and Greece, would join the Allied side. But it was based on the mistaken belief that the Ottomans were weak and could be easily overcome. The Dardanelles, now in Turkey. On February 19th, the British and French forces launched a naval attack against Turkish forces in the Dardanelles. The Allied forces aimed at controlling, they wanted control of the Key Strait that was connecting Europe to Asia. The campaign was not successful, and it was a big, big loss for the Allies. Hundreds of thousands of men perished on both sides. Allies lost several important battleships to mines in the water. The Allies had hoped the victory would garner more support for their side from some of the states that remained neutral, like Bulgaria and Greece and Romania. Contained by Ottoman defenders, the new assault began on August 6th. Each fresh attempt was defeated, and by mid-January 1916, all the Allied troops had been evacuated and the attack on the Dardanelles abandoned. You see this up in Canada every year. You see this flower on the lapel around what was then Armistice Day, now it's Veterans Day, not in the United States, in Flanders Field. And it's a famous poem that came out of World War I. In Flanders Field was by a Canadian physician, although they were British subjects at the time. Canada was a quasi-country. Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. He was inspired to write it on May 3rd after presiding over the funeral of his friend and fellow soldier, Lieutenant Alexis Helmer, who died in the Second Battle of Ypres. According to legend, fellow soldiers retrieved the poem after McCrae, initially dissatisfied with his work, discarded it. In Flanders Field was first published on December 8th of that year, 1915, in the London magazine called Punch. Flanders Field is a common name of the World War I battlefields in Belgium and Germany. The United States is going to be put into a position where they have to decide whether or not they're going to war by May of 1915. The sinking of the Lusitania, and that changes many minds in America. America, after all, we're not getting involved in this war, at least not yet. In fact, we don't even want to get involved in this war. But there's a sinking of the ship, the Lusitania, which was doing a regular route across the Atlantic, New York to Liverpool, England, Liverpool, back to New York. That's what it was doing. Germany declared the waters surrounding the British Isles to be war zones, and German U-boats sunk several commercial and passenger vessels, including some U.S. ships. Widespread protest over the sinking by the U-boat of a British ocean liner, Lusitania, traveling from New York to Liverpool with hundreds of American passengers on board on May 7th, helped turn the tide of American public opinion against Germany. But one guy was not convinced. This is William Jennings Bryan. He had run for president in 1869, or rather 1896. He also ran for president in 1900, in 1908. He is Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State, and he really doesn't think that U.S. should be doing any kind of shipping through the war zones. And he tells that to Wilson. He says, we do this, we're definitely going to get involved in the war. But his advice to Wilson is ignored. On June 9th, the Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, resigns due to his concerns over President Woodrow Wilson's handling of the crisis generated by the submarine sinking by Germany of the British passenger liner Lusitania in the previous month. 1,201 people died, including 128 Americans. When the German government responded by justifying their Navy's action on the basis that the Lusitania was carrying munitions, and I told you what the guy from Holland America told us back about 7 years ago, Wilson himself penned a strongly worded note insisting that the sinking had been an illegal action and demanding that Germany cease unrestricted submarine warfare against unmerchant shipmen. This guy, Robert Lansing, replaces William Jennings Bryan, and the last guy who basically is opposing the war in Wilson's cabinet is gone. Lansing would be in favor of the Wilson policies. Objecting to the strong position taken by Wilson in the second Lusitania note and believing it could be taken as a precursor to a war declaration, Bryan is out of there on June 9th. He's not signing that note. Bryan's resignation marked a turning point as the Lusitania crisis convinced his successor, Robert Lansing, that the U.S. could not remain neutral forever. And another ship would go down in 1915, another British ship. Again, these ships were carrying munitions, like the guy from Holland America said, who was the historian for Holland America. On August 19, 1915, the German submarine sunk the British ocean liner, the SS Arabic, and claimed self-defense. This event furthered strained diplomatic relations between the United States and Germany. President Wilson warned Germany that if it was determined they sunk the ship without cause, the United States may cut diplomatic ties and enter to the war on the Allies' side. Germany would cave. In September, they said, we're not going to sink any more ships without warning. Satisfied for at least the moment, Wilson chose not to declare war on Germany, despite being encouraged. Otherwise, people like Teddy Roosevelt, who was thinking of running for president in 1916, and others said, you gotta go. How many of you have heard of this movie, Birth of a Nation?
What was your question?
How many of you have heard of the movie Birth of a Nation?
Oh, no.
Okay, no? Okay, how many say no? How many say yes?
Yes.
Okay, so most of you have said no, we're not talking about it. Birth of a Nation. D.W. Griffith's stupendous motion picture production of Thomas Dixon's famous story, The Klansman. Okay, this kickstarts the new Ku Klux Klan in the United States. This movie gets it going. On January 1st, the actor and filmmaker D.W. Griffith previews his new movie, The Klansman, at the Loring Opera House at 3745 7th Street, Riverside, California. Riverside's about 85, 90 miles east of Los Angeles, although in those days, very few people lived in California. Based on the Thomas Dixon 1905 novel, The Klansman, The Birth of the Nation begins as the South marches into battle to defend a way of life the North wants eradicated. The second half finds a defeated South at the mercy of Northern carpetbaggers, vengeful Union politicians, and easily manipulated free slaves. At least that's what the book is about. All that remains of the South's honor during Reconstruction is the virtuous women. Once this honor is threatened by the renegade Negro, the Ku Klux Klan is born, imposing order on the chaos and releasing Southern whites from under the heel of blacks. That's what the book's about. It's what the movie's about. And it presents a narrative. And the narrative is transmitted to people through the movie, and people begin to believe the movie. Birth of a Nation, $5 a seat. It's an incredible amount of money. $5 a seat, movie theater in Seattle on June the 18th. Birth of the Nation drew harsh criticism for honoring the Klan's historic role in the opposition to the Reconstruction idea that black people could be successfully integrated into white society. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People published a pamphlet denouncing the film, referring to it as 3 miles of filth. Birth of the Nation was released officially on February 8th. In just over 3 hours, D.W. Griffith's controversial epic film depicted the Ku Klux Klan as the valiant saviors of post-war Southern ravage by Northern carpetbaggers and immorally freed black people. The film was an instant blockbuster. Most white audiences love the film, and they're paying $2 a ticket. You know how much $2 a ticket is today? That's $60. $60 to see the film. And they're seeing it. And it leads to the revival of the Klan and lynching. Well, lynchings were going on and burning at the stakes, but the Klan now is organized again. On February 18th, upon seeing the movie Birth of the Nation at a special White House screening, the President Woodrow Wilson reportedly remarked, "It's like writing history with lightning. My only regret is that it is so terribly true." Wilson believed in the lost cause. The lost cause is the South. And on April 11th, 1913, he segregated the post office, which was the home to over 60% of federal jobs at the time and employed many black workers. He segregated the post office. It was okay to undo the Reconstruction. In fact, Wilson is even quoted in the film. There is a film card, because it was a silent movie, but there is a film card, Woodrow Wilson. The white men were aroused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until, at last, there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. That is in the movie, Woodrow Wilson's quote. And that's a title card that's in there. Anybody ever been to Stone Mountain, Georgia? You have. Okay, Stone Mountain, Georgia is north of Atlanta. North of Atlanta. It's about 30 miles north of Atlanta. And we were in Atlanta, my wife and I, back in 2015. And we had to go to a family function there. So we had a couple days to do some stuff. And she said, well, what are we going to do? And I said, well, we're going somewhere. She said, well, where we're going? I said, I'm not going to tell you until we get there. And she said, why? I said, because I want to see the look on your face when you see something there. We get there and she sees this carved in the mountain. Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson, the heroes of the South. And this is Stone Mountain, Georgia, which is a majority town today. But that is where the Klan was revived. The popularity of Birth of the Nation, and specifically its showing in Atlanta, Georgia, provided the major impetus for the re-emergence of the Ku Klux Klan. Alabama-born William J. Simmons held a ceremony atop Stone Mountain, Georgia on November 25th to announce the refounding of the Ku Klux Klan. The venerable family who owned the mountain allowed Simmons and his version of the Klan to use the mountain for its rituals. And this is a scene from the movie. That's a scene from, well, at least Griffith hired African-American actors, right? But this is a scene from the movie. On opening night, December 6th, Simmons and his fellow Klansmen, dressed in white sheets and Confederate uniforms, paraded down Peachtree Street with hooded horses, firing rifle salutes in front of the theater.
What year is this?
1915. And it would go on until 1916. This is Salt Lake City, and these are ushers who are dressed up. Ushers in the movie, complete in a Klan outfit, and the horse has Birth of the Nation. This was going on around the country. Around the country, ushers were dressing up like Klansmen. And you could also get KKK material at the movie houses. The effect was powerful, and screenings in most cities echoed the display, including movie ushers donning white sheets. Klansmen also handed out KKK literature before and after screenings. Would you ever go back to that movie theater after that? Would you return to see anything else at that movie theater after the owner allowed this or dressed his ushers up in Klansman uniforms? The Birth of the Nation was the longest and most profitable film produced and was the most artistically advanced film of the era. The film grossed somewhere between $13 and $18 million, roughly $300 to $450 million in today's money. Well, that's the country. But it wasn't just 1915 that this started. Jack Johnson was the heavyweight champion of the boxing world. And Congress went after him. The boxing people went after him. And they were always looking for the great white hope. Great white hope. Somebody to knock off Jack Johnson. On April 5th, Jack Johnson lost his heavyweight boxing title to Jess Willard, a working cowboy from Kansas who started boxing when he was 27 years old. A crowd of about 25,000 at Oriental Park Racetrack, Havana, Cuba, watched. Johnson was knocked down in the 26th round of a 45-round fight. It's now 12 or 15 rounds. Those days, 45 rounds. 3 minutes per round. More than 2 hours the people would fight. Boxing matches, well, they could last 45 rounds in those days. In late 1914, two promoters, Jack Curley, and if you're a baseball fan of the New York Yankees, you will know this name, Harry Frazee. He was the guy who traded Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees in 1919, 1920. Began to work to arrange a title fight between Jack Johnson and Jess Willard. The fight was set for 45 rounds in Havana on Monday, April 5th, 1915. Willard was given very little chance to win, but he was younger than Johnson, and unlike Johnson, he took his training seriously. After 26 rounds, the heat 105 degrees. 105 degrees, they have already fought for 75 minutes in the ring. Johnson was exhausted. A straight right hand from Willard took him by surprise. He slid to the canvas. Willard was now the heavyweight champion of the world. But again, we're talking about the Great White Hope, and you can see Willard was much bigger than Johnson, and he fits the stereotype. He is the Great White Hope. Jack Johnson was boxing's first heavyweight champion. He won the title in 1908, went on to outrage the public with his refusal to abide by the expectation of both polite society and a racist America which regarded black people as second-class citizens. Instead, he did what he damn well pleased. He flaunted his wealth, opening, carrying on with white women, even marrying more than one. There were repeated campaigns to find a great white hope to set things right. Even Congress gets into the act. This is a guy by the name of Mann. One of the landmark of the progressive era, one of the landmark of acts of the progressive era was the White Slave Trade Act, which was better known as the Mann Act for its author, Illinois Congressman James Robert Mann. The Mann Act made it a crime to transport women across state lines for the purpose of prostitution or debauchery or any other immoral purpose. How many people that you know have violated the Mann Act? Every one of you probably know. Every one of you probably know. Take your girlfriend and get across state lines for debauchery, right? That's against the law. Still is. Anyway, while designed to combat forced prostitution, the law was so broadly worded that courts held it to criminalize many forms of consensual sexual activity, and soon it was being used as a tool for political prosecution of Jack Johnson and others, as well as a tool for blackmail. And Jackson is arrested for breaking the Mann Act, or violating the Mann Act. Johnson was one of the law's first victims. When he beat a white boxer, undefeated heavyweight champion James J. Jeffries in a highly publicized bout in 1910, it triggered race riots. It also made law enforcement take a closer look at Jackson, who is known for his flamboyant behavior and lavish spending. This behavior had long rankled those who thought an African-American man should know his place and stay in it. On October 18th, 1912, prosecutors got their chance to enforce the Mann Act when Lucille Cameron's mother accused Jackson, of kidnapping her daughter and transporting her across state lines. Though Jackson was in a consensual relationship with the 18-year-old Cameron, who was a prostitute, prosecutors used the accusation as a pretext. When Chicago police arrested him for kidnapping, federal prosecutors assembled a grand jury to investigate his relationships with white women. Here they are, and they did get married, Jackson and Lucille Cameron. There was just one problem. Cameron, who was in love with Jackson, refused to say anything that incriminated him. Then prosecutors found out she had been a prostitute, which undermined her credibility as a witness. They dropped the case temporarily, but not before the public caught wind of it. On December 4th, Jackson and Cameron were married, an act that outraged the public. Prosecutors soon hit on another excuse to enforce the law. Jackson's past relationship with Belle Schreiber, a white prostitute who agreed to testify against him. Schreiber's testimony, along with Jackson's recent marriage to Cameron, convinced the jury that he had run afoul of the Mann Act and had taken her across state lines for immoral purposes. An all-white jury convicted him, and he was sentenced to a year and a day in prison. I lived in Rockland County. I lived on the New York-New Jersey border, as did my friends. We could have all been prosecuted under the Mann Act. That's how stupid the Mann Act was. But they were after Jack Johnson and others, including eventually Chuck Berry and Charlie Chaplin. Around the United States, lawmakers introduced bills to ban marriage between black and white people in multiple states. None passed. However, this illustrated how preoccupied the nation was with Jackson's interracial relationship and his supposed crime. This is the Representative Seaborn Roddenberry. I don't know if he's related to Gene Roddenberry, who wrote the Star Trek episodes, but his name is Roddenberry. In December 1912 and January 1913, Representative Seaborn Roddenberry, a Democrat of Georgia, introduced a proposal in the House of Representatives to insert a prohibition of interracial marriage in the United States Constitution. If passed by Congress, it would have gone out to people around the country to vote on as an amendment to the Constitution. Intermarriage between Negroes or persons of color and Caucasians in the United States is forever prohibited. The proposal went nowhere. Jackson arrested allegedly for breaking the Mann Act. In 1913, 30 of the then 48 states enforced interracial marriage laws, as legally blacks and whites could not marry in those locales. Where they could marry: Connecticut, New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, Vermont, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Alaska, Hawaii, and Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is not a state, it's a federal district. Years later, there would be the Loving case in 1966-67 that would settle the question of interracial marriage. Supreme Court ruling in favor of, yes, it's legal in 1967. Out on bail, pending appeal of his conviction, Jackson leaves the country disguised as a member of a black baseball team to Canada with Cameron. He continued to fight overseas, including 2 defenses of his world title in Paris. The next great white hope. America is looking for the next great white hope. In fact, there was a Broadway play about that in the 1960s. Desperate for cash, Jackson accepted an offer from promoter Jack Curley for $30,000, about $911,000 today. Routinely, boxers make hundreds of millions of dollars in heavyweight championship fights today. To fight another white hope. If Curley could guarantee the money and arrange the contest close enough to the U.S. to attract ticket buyers, they had a deal. Well, let's do it in Mexico. Can't do it in Mexico, according to Jackson. Well, why not? Well, I'm afraid that the Texas Rangers are going to kidnap me. They're not going to kidnap me in Havana. Let's go to Havana. That's where they had the fight. When Curley met Johnson, like I said, he was in need of a big payday. Jackson, and there's only one legitimate candidate who can fit the great white hope role. They found Jess Willard. He was 6'6", weighed 250 pounds. He had an 84-inch reach. He agreed to a $5,000 contract, $152,000, and 1/3 of the motion picture rights if they could get the movie of the fight into the theater. Well, the white hope arrives, and there is Jackson, and there is Willard. Willard wins. In the 26th round, Willard delivered a lightning-quick straight right that landed at the point of Jackson's chin, and the champ went down, slumped to the canvas. Rolled over on his back, was counted out. Years later, Jackson would say he took a dive. Whether he did or he didn't is unknown, but he claimed he did. Jackson accepted the defeat by saying, "I've been beaten fairly by youth and condition." How many of you ever heard of the lynching of Leo Frank?
Leo who?
Leo Frank. There was a movie about it on, I think, NBC or ABC TV. The lynching of Leo Frank. And that takes place in 1915. And it's a long story. On August 25th, 1913, Leo Frank was convicted of murdering Mary Fagan, a 13-year-old employee of an Atlanta pencil factory that Frank managed. After his death sentence was commuted by the Georgia governor, a mob stormed the prison where Frank was being held and lynched him. Frank is the only known Jew that was lynched in American history, and that is 13-year-old Mary Fagan. By the way, it was perfectly okay to use a 13-year-old in any work back then. There were no child labor laws back then in the United States, and there are some states today, about 22 of them, that have no problems with child labor laws revoking them, including Arkansas. They claim, well, we don't have enough workers, but child labor is coming back. It was out by the mid-1920s. A century later, child labor is returning to the United States. Little Mary Fagan, as she became known, left home on the morning of April 26, 1913, to pick up her wages at the pencil factory and view the Confederate Day Parade. She never returned home. The next day, the factory watchman found her sawdust-covered body in a factory basement. When Frank, who had just completed a term as the president of the Atlanta chapter of B'nai B'rith, was asked to view the body, he became agitated, confirmed personally paying Mary her tier wages, but could not say when she went next. Frank was the last to see Mary alive and becomes the main suspect. That is Leo Frank. Georgia's Solicitor General, Hugh Dorsey, saw the grand jury indictment against Frank. Rumors circulated that Mary had been sexually assaulted. Factory employees offered apparently false testimony that Frank had made sexual advances to them. The madam of the House of Ill Repute claimed that Frank had phoned her several times seeking a room for herself and a young girl. For the grand jury, Hugh Dorsey painted Frank as a sexual pervert who is both a homosexual and preyed on young girls. But, like many other district attorneys, they kind of leave out stories, or attorney generals. Let's not show the witness this part of the testimony, because if we do, and we make the decision, not them, we may lose the case. So we're going to keep this piece of information out. Jim Conley had been arrested 2 days after Frank when he was seen washing blood off his shirt. Conley then admitted writing 2 notes found by Mary Fagan's body. But he left that out. He left that out. How'd you like to be a juror finding out afterwards that that stuff was left out? It's done routinely to this day. At the time when the cult of Southern chivalry made it a hanging crime for African American males to have sexual contact with the flower of white womanhood, these accusations against Frank, a northern-born, college-educated Jew, proved equally inflammatory. The lynching of Leo Frank. Even after Frank's housekeeper placed him at home, having lunch at the time of the murder, and despite gross inconsistencies in Conley's story, both the grand jury and the trial jury chose to believe Conley. This was a rare instance of a Southern black man's testimony being used to convict a white man. In August 1913, the jury found Frank guilty in less than 4 hours, while crowds outside the courtroom shouted, "Hang the Jew." The police assumed that as the author of these notes, Conley was the murderer. But Conley claimed, after apparent coaching from Dorsey, the district attorney, that Leo Frank had confessed murdering Mary in the lathe room and paid Conley to pen the notes and help him move Mary's body to the basement. Apparently, the district attorney, Dorsey, had his own story. Might have been right, might have been wrong, but he had his own story. Might have been a crooked DA. What do you think? The governor, Frank Slayton, in 1915, makes a decision. On June 21st, and it ruins his career. After a 12-day review of the evidence and letters recommending commuting from the trial judge and a private investigator who worked for Hugh Dorsey, he does commute Frank's sentence to life imprisonment. That night, state police kept a protesting crowd of 5,000 away from the governor's mansion in Atlanta. That is Leo Frank.
Who decides they're going to kill somebody?
This mob. This mob. And that's Leo Frank swinging from a tree. Soon after the commuting of the sentence on August 25th, a group of 25 men decided to take the law in their own hands. Described by peers as sober, intelligent, of established good name and character, they stormed the prison hospital where Leo Frank was recovering from having his throat slashed by a fellow inmate. They kidnapped Frank, drove 100 miles to Mary Fagan's hometown, Marietta, Georgia, and hanged him from a tree. Hanged him from a tree. None of them ever faced any kind of punishment. None of them. The lynching of Leo Frank. Again, there's the picture. Townsfolk were proudly photographed beneath Frank's swinging corpse. On August 19th, the New York Times reported that the vast majority of Cobb County, Georgia, believed Frank had received his just desserts and that the lynch mob simply stepped in to uphold the law after Governor Slayton arbitrarily set it aside. Vengeance, vengeance, mob mentality. That was going on in the United States all those years ago. How many of you ever heard of Emma Goldman? Nobody's ever heard of Emma Goldman? She was an anarchist. She was a communist. She was a socialist. She was a social worker. And she believed in free speech, and she believed in birth control. She believed in birth control. In the 1890s, Goldman worked as a nurse and midwife among poor immigrants in New York City's Lower East Side. She might have helped the Stiller family back in those days. I'm related to Jerry Stiller, and they were down on the Lower East Side at that time. They had come in. She campaigned for legalized birth control, believing that contraception was essential to a woman's social, sexual, and economic freedom. Emma Goldman was arrested for lecturing and distributing material in support of birth control. Goldman was an early mentor of Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood. Goldman was asked to perform abortions, but refused because she saw that it would do nothing to tackle the social problem. She fought for birth control as a positive alternative. I can't prove this, but I remember when I was 8, 9 years old, my grandmother talked about back alley abortions. And my grandmother, who was born in about 1903, may have run into Emma Goldman as a 12 or 13-year-old back in New York City when Emma Goldman was talking about birth control. My grandmother ended up being a delegate for the Lower East Side. In fact, she ran the Lower East Side Democratic Committee for a while, and her daughter, Pearl Berkowitz, ended up being Bella Abzug's chief of staff. That is Margaret Sanger. Goldman was working. How many of you heard of Margaret Sanger? Just you.
No, there's got to be more.
Yeah, Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood. She gets arrested also. Why? Guess what she's talking about? Birth control. You talked about birth control publicly, they're going to arrest you in 1915. Louisiana Republicans now want to ban birth control. That is what has come out in the last week in Louisiana. The Republicans want to ban birth control devices. The National Birth Control League, a United States organization founded in March by Mary Dennett, Jesse Ashley, Clara Grunning, Stillman, and Margaret Sanger. It was America's first birth control organization. Sanger came up with the term birth control, and the authorities would go after her. The goal of the group was to improve birth control education and to change laws that prohibited access to information about how to prevent contraception. This is what's being argued about in some southern states right now. This is 2024, and this argument is taking place 109 years later. It published birth control literature, drafted federal legislation concepts, held conferences at its New York City headquarters. Sanger embarked on the successful cross-country speaking tour, which led her into the leadership of the U.S. birth control movement. How many of you ever heard of Alice Paul? Okay, heard of her. Women's rights again, women's voting rights. There have been various political officials in the last year talking about how women should have the right to vote taken away from them. Radicals. 109 years, well, this goes back more than 109 years, but this is Alice Paul. Alice Paul realized that being polite and sweetly asking for the right to vote was not getting women anywhere, and that radical tactics were necessary. For a woman, that might mean standing on the street corner holding a sign or speaking out from a stage, radical acts. While imprisoned in England, she learned that hunger strikes were an effective way to get attention and bring sympathy to her cause. Paul returned to the United States in 1910 10, she was a highly educated woman. She got a PhD from Penn in 1912, a degree in sociology. She was very highly educated. She went to Swarthmore. And turned her attention to the American suffrage movement after the deaths of Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1902 and Susan B. Anthony in 1906. The suffrage movement was languishing, lacking focus under conservative suffrage organizations that concentrated on achieving state suffrage, and some of those states were successful. She believed the movement needed to focus on the passage of federal suffrage and an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. In 1911, she led Philadelphia's first street corner campaign for the right to vote. Night after night for 2 months, speaking from a horse-drawn cart, Paul and other suffragettes made their case to crowds that sometimes numbered in the hundreds. At her side was a woman by the name of Lucy Burns from Brooklyn. She met her in a London police station as they were helping out the English or the Brits and the women there who were fighting for the vote. And there is Lucy Burns. Paul and Burns offered to take over control of the National Women's Suffragette Association's Congressional Committee in Washington, D.C., which was tasked with promoting a constitutional amendment. She topped her action list with a plan for a parade, a spectacle never seen before in Washington. The Women's Suffragette Parade, which was March 3rd, 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated as president. There were 8,000 women there, mostly women, wearing white or clad in colorful caps and also capes. And they were interspersed with mounted brigades and decorated floats which were let loose on Pennsylvania Avenue. The first float proclaimed, "We demand an amendment to the Constitution of the United States enfranchising the women of the country." Demand was a bad word. A woman could not demand anything. She was a radical if she demanded anything. She might ask nicely or politely. Using the word demand, no. That's a fighting word. Nice women didn't do that. They were putting an unsympathetic Woodrow Wilson on notice that they expected action. No sooner was Paul's parade underway when thousands of onlookers spilled into its path, blocking his progress. Men spit at the marchers. Men spit at women. They threw lighted cigarettes at the women. They hurled insults. And where's the police? Nowhere to be found. The police, nowhere to be found. They turned their backs. The women were on their own. They had to defend themselves as best they could. To the surprise of many, Paul was pleased by the chaos. The parade made news coast to coast. This is a parade in Washington again, May 9th, 1914. The Senate had voted against a proposed constitutional amendment that called for states to decide if women should vote nationally. The measure fell short of the required 2/3 votes of the Senate needed to pass the proposal to the states. The only time this happened before was in 1868 when women's voting rights was first presented to Congress. This is a New York City protest. We want the vote. New York City protest. Activists leave Washington, D.C. to campaign against Democratic congressional candidates in states where women were already enfranchised. On October 23rd, 1914, 25,000 supporters of women's right to vote marched down Fifth Avenue, led by Dr. Anna Shaw and Carrie Chapman Catt, the founder of the League of Women Voters. Well, this is a congressman by the name of Stanley E. Bodle, and he makes a sexist speech. You might want to listen to this speech. January 12th, the House of Representatives rejects a proposal to give women the right to vote. Anti-suffrage Representative Stanley Bodle of Ohio gave an incredibly sexist speech on the floor. Listen to this. "The women of this smart capital are beautiful. Their beauty is disturbing to business." This guy must have a foot fetish. Listen to this. "Their feet are beautiful. Their ankles are beautiful. But here I must pause, for they're not interested in the state. Guy must have had a foot fetish, but rejected again. The vote was a second defeat for the suffrage amendment in less than a year, but the suffragette leaders were pleased to have this issue discussed in Congress. They felt they made some progress. Meanwhile, in Denmark, and notice all these countries and all these states, the women are all dressed the same. They're all clad in white. That's their uniform. They're at war, of course, trying to get the right to vote. And that is Copenhagen. On June 5th, voting rights were granted to women in Denmark. The rights also extended to women living in Iceland as well. That was still part of the Danish kingdom along with Greenland. In 1886, the Women's Progress Association was created and began establishing a woman's voice on important Danish social issues. And by 1889, the Women's Suffrage Association was created with the sole purpose of establishing voters' rights for women in Denmark. And this is one of the posters used back in the day, basically saying, hey, you know what? Let's get the right to vote. In the early 1900s, steps were made toward the enfranchisement of women in Denmark as various groups were allowed to vote in local elections. In 1915, a new Danish constitution was passed which included full voting rights for women as well as other reforms to the Danish government system. Literacy tests and immigration. We're still talking about immigration today, aren't we? Aren't we? We're still talking about it. Still talking about it. It's 109 years ago. 109 years, wait, all these things I'm talking about, they could be today, right? Have we made progress in 109 years? Or have we gone backwards? It's a question you can answer. There was a growing backlash against newly arriving immigrants. The prevailing thought was that older immigrants were skilled, thrifty, hardworking like native-born Americans. Well, the native-born Americans were not native-born Americans, white people from Europe, but they have been here, the indigenous people have been here forever. And recent immigrants from the southern and eastern parts of Europe were unskilled, ignorant, and they were predominantly Catholic from Italy or Jewish, and they were not assimilating into American culture. Something had to be done. America was becoming a dumping ground. Woodrow Wilson said no to literacy tests. No, no, it's not fair. What kind of literacy tests are you going to give them? Well, basically, let's see if they know basic words in their own language. January 28th, Wilson rejects an immigration bill. To the House of Representatives, and this is what he says, "It is with unaffected regret that I find myself constrained by clear conscience to return this bill, H.R. 6060, an act to regulate the immigration of aliens and to residents of aliens in the United States without my signature." The reason why Wilson said no, it included a literacy test to get into America. Wilson, if the people of this country have made up their minds to limit the number of immigrants by arbitrary tests and so reverse the policy of all generations of America that have gone before them, it is their right to do so. I am their servant, and I have no license to stand in their way, but I do not believe that they have. Ahoy, ahoy! When you pick up the telephone, what do you say?
Hello.
Hello, right?
Right.
Well, Alexander Graham Bell didn't want you to say hello. He wanted you to say ahoy, ahoy. Well, he makes a telephone call to his old friend Watson. But Watson's not in the next room. He's in San Francisco. The first transcontinental call, a long-distance telephone call, was made possible by a newly invented vacuum tube amplifier, was made on January 25th. Alexander Graham Bell, he's in Manhattan, and he calls his old assistant, Thomas Augustus Watson, in San Francisco. And the conversation's a little different than the original conversation. Ahoy, ahoy! Bell wanted you to say ahoy when you picked up the phone. It became hello. Mr. Watson, are you there? Do you hear me? Woodrow Wilson was on the call from the White House, as well as Theodore Vail, the president of AT&T, from Jekyll Island in Georgia. How would you like to say ahoy, ahoy when somebody calls you? Do you want to do that?
Yeah, no.
Yeah, who, you? No. Anybody said yes?
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
That'd
you
be
want,
fun.
you'd be fun to say ahoy, ahoy?
Yeah.
So next time somebody calls you, say ahoy.
Oh, well.
Say ahoy, ahoy. And they can say, what? Oh, tell them that Alexander Graham Bell told you to say that. There was a challenge to Major League Baseball starting in 1914. The challenger was the Federal League, and they wanted to become a third major league. The Federal League came together in the early 1913 through the work of John T. Powers and immediately challenged the operations of organized baseball as a minor league playing outside the National Association agreement. After James A. Gilmore succeeded Powers as league president, the league decided it should be a major league. Playing in what detractors called the Outlaw League allowed players to avoid the restrictions of organized leagues, reserve clause which forced the player to be on the team in perpetuity unless the team ridded themselves of that player. The minor league Baltimore Orioles franchise was hurt financially by the Federal League's Baltimore Terrapins franchise, had to sell players off to make ends meet. The owner, Jack Dunn, sold a young guy. Actually, he was the guy, he was given possession of this guy as the way when this guy was in the orphanage at St. Mary's, and Jack Dunn agreed to be his patron. So Jack Dunn got him on the Baltimore Orioles team. The guy's name was Babe Ruth. You ever hear of Babe Ruth? He sold his contract to the American League's Boston Red Sox franchise in 1914. In a Red Sox uniform, Babe Ruth hit his first home run in 1915. The competition of another better paying league caused the players' salaries to skyrocket, demonstrating that the bargaining potential of free agency for the first time in years since the war between the American League and National League ended in 1903 with the signing of the National Agreement. The league had 8 teams: Baltimore, Brooklyn, Buffalo, Chicago, Indianapolis, Kansas City, Pittsburgh, St. Louis all had franchises. Brooklyn, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis competing against major league teams. This guy is Cy Falkenberg of the Brooklyn Federals and Victor Sporting Goods. He's basically shilling for Victor Sporting Goods. I guess that he was endorsing their products. The new league was initially successful getting people to see games, but financial strains battling MLB teams and skyrocketing player salaries doomed the league to extinction after 1915. Indianapolis had moved to Newark. After the league had folded, 7 of the 8 teams reached an accommodation with Major League Baseball. Among other things, the Chicago Whales owners were allowed to buy the Chicago Cubs franchise, move them into Weigman Park, which was later renamed Wrigley Field. St. Louis Terriers ownership took over the St. Louis Browns business. The league lasted 2 years, last league that challenged the American and National Leagues in obtaining players. Of the 286 to play in the Federal League in the 2 years, 172 had Major League experience according to the Society of American Baseball Research. Of that number, 71 would return to American and National League clubs after the league folded, but most stars stayed in the National League and American League. This team causes problems for Major League Baseball, the Baltimore Terrapins. By 1916, the owners of the Baltimore Terrapins refused to settle, sued the National League for antitrust violations. The Terrapins ownership alleged that the buyout was in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and that would wind through the courts for the next 6 years. The Terrapins ownership wanted to be admitted to the National or American League as a big league club, but the Major League owners didn't think Baltimore was a suitable market. They thought the city was too small. There was one other problem. National League and American League owners also thought Baltimore had too large of a black population. Baseball had the color barrier up, and the last colored players in Major League Baseball were employed in 1884. the lawsuit would eventually have a significant impact on the baseball industry. How many of you heard of the Ziegfeld Follies? Flo Ziegfeld. Fanny Brice came out of the Ziegfeld Follies. Well, it was vaudeville, it was Broadway, and the movies. That's what you had for entertainment back in the day. The Ziegfeld Follies was a theatrical juggernaut that transformed the Broadway musical. When the show first mounted in 1907, no one, not even the producer, Florenz Ziegfeld, could have possibly imagined its impact. Ziegfeld was simply trying to mount a light, inexpensive entertainment for the summer season on Broadway. The Follies of 1907 was such a smash hit that Ziegfeld soon attached his own name to it and began mounting it annually as the main event of the Broadway season. It also became a newsworthy event that was covered in gossip columns from coast to coast. Shows in vaudeville also featured dozens of different artists or acts at the time performing all kinds of materials. If you watch the old Ed Sullivan Show, that was a vaudeville show. Ed Sullivan was a vaudeville show, and so in a certain way was the Carol Burnett Show, and probably Carol Burnett was the last vaudeville show ever to be seen. And all kinds of materials were in those shows: songs, comedy routines, magic, acrobatics, novelty acts, dramatic readings, and they were on something called bills. The performers repeated their act, lasted about 10 minutes, twice a day for a week, and then went on to the next town, or the next city, or the next theaters. Broadway was an easier gig, and was pulling performers from vaudeville. And you may, okay, you're not going to, people that were pulled included the Marx Brothers. I'll talk about that in a minute. 1915 legacy. World War I ended on the battlefield November 11, 1918. Wilson and the Americans entered the war April 6, 1917. Wilson attempted to negotiate a peace, started an international body called the League of Nations to prevent future wars. Americans never joined the League of Nations. They never signed off on the two treaties that actually ended the war, the 1919 Treaty of Versailles and the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne. Birth of a Nation, major impact, maybe to this day. D.W. Griffith is hailed as Hollywood's first great artistic director, whose pioneer filmmaking spawned a new art form, the feature-length film, and the modern motion picture industry. 1992, the National Film Board registered Birth of a Nation to keep forever on the basis of its cultural, historic, and aesthetic importance. In 1999, the Film Institute ranks the film among the top of the 20th century, top films of the 20th century. Both of these decisions and related showings of the Birth of a Nation prompted protests. In December 1999, the Directors Guild of America announces that D.W. Griffith will be retired as the namesake of its prestigious award for career achievement in movie making because he helped promote what they called intolerable racial stereotypes. Although Guild members acknowledged his achievement, the vote to rename the award is unanimous. The Ku Klux Klan is back. They would increase their membership. They'd have a march in Washington in 1925. But their influence began to wane in 1925 after a jury found the Indiana Grand Dragon, David C. Stevenson, guilty of rape, kidnapping, and second-degree murder of a female aide. That is Donald Trump in 2018, and he pardons Jackson, violating the Antitrust Act by taking his white girlfriend across state lines. Jackson surrendered to U.S. authorities in 1920, Jack Johnson rather, and he served 10 months in prison. Johnson's story was the focus of the Pulitzer Prize winning play, The Great White Hope, starring James Earl Jones in 1969. Jess Willard portrayed or parlayed his boxing fame into an acting career. He acted in a vaudeville show, had a role in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and starred in the 1919 feature film, The Challenge of Chance. In 1933, he appeared in a bit part in a boxing movie, The Prize Fighter and the Lady with Max Baer and Myrna Loy. B'nai B'rith, the Anti-Defamation League, starts after the lynching of Leo Frank. To help defend Leo Frank, B'nai B'rith created the Anti-Defamation League. In 1986, the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles finally granted Leo Frank a posthumous pardon, not on the grounds that they thought he was innocent, because his lynching deprived him of his right to further appeal. The Murder of Mary Phagan was a 1988 American two-part miniseries starring Jack Lemmon. The descendants of Mary Phagan's family and their supporters still insist on his guilt. Emma Goldman. In 1916, she was arrested again for publicly speaking about birth control and would do 2 weeks in jail. 1917, Emma Goldman was arrested for violating the 1917 Espionage Act for speaking against the selective draft law. After 2 years in prison in Missouri, she was deported to Russia in 1919, along with several hundred other radical immigrants. She lived and worked in Russia until 1921. When she left, she was disillusioned with the Russian Revolution. Exiled from the United States, she traveled through Europe, delivering lectures as an advocate of anarchism and individual freedom. She lived for a time in Saint-Tropez, France, where she wrote her memoir, Living My Life, in 1931, and in Toronto, where she died in 1940. Ironically enough, she's buried in the United States, in Chicago. Planned Parenthood. 1916, Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control clinic, the Brownsville Clinic in Brooklyn, and was arrested, with New York City officials closing the clinic. She served jail time in 1917. 1921, she founded the American Birth Control League, which became Planned Parenthood, or the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. 1923, she established the Birth Control Clinical Research Bureau. In 2021, Planned Parenthood denounced Margaret Sanger's belief in eugenics. Eugenics, a popular theory during the early part of the 20th century, was an ideology that labeled certain people unfit to have children. Votes for women. On September 30th, 1918, Wilson stood before the Senate and called for the passage of the 19th Amendment. On August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. On November 2nd of that year, more than 8 million additional women across the United States were able to vote for the first time. The Wall. The Wall. This is from the 19-teens, this cartoon. Where's the wall come from? Well, what's it doing? It's blocking the immigrants. They built the wall, at least in the cartoon. An immigration bill that Wilson vetoed in 1916 was passed by Congress in 1917. And it would introduce an Asic barrier zone, designating that people from much of Eastern and the Pacific Islands, Eastern Asia and the Pacific Islands, could not immigrate to the United States. Baltimore got its Major League Baseball team in 1954. The Baltimore Terrapins lawsuit went through the courts, and 102 years ago today, Supreme Court made a decision, 102 years ago today. In 1922, the Supreme Court ruled that baseball was a game, not an interstate business, which meant when Brooklyn traveled to Pittsburgh to play a baseball game, it was a game. Even though the Brooklyn Dodgers franchise and the Pittsburgh Pirates franchises were businesses. They get an antitrust exemption, which means they can do whatever they want, business-wise. Babe Ruth became baseball's biggest star by 1919. Baltimore investors purchased the St. Louis Browns franchise after the 1953 season. The new Baltimore Orioles franchise began playing in 1954. Investors of a new baseball circuit, the Continental League, announced plans to become a third major league in 1959. The league never got off the ground, but forced the National League to expand to Houston. And any New York Mets fans here? You're the only New York Mets fan here. Meet the Mets, meet the Mets. That's the New York Mets' existence was created by the Continental League. And we leave with these guys. You may not recognize them, but you recognize their names. This guy right here is Harpo Marx. That is Groucho Marx. The Marx Brothers. They were on the vaudeville circuit. After the war, at the beginning of vaudeville's demise, Broadway revues were becoming increasingly upscale and more competitive with each other. Variety added a category called legit theater, to distinguish these classier productions from vaud. One way for a revue producer to rise above the crowd was to import a vaudeville superstar, even better and cheaper, to create a Broadway superstar from the rank and file. Radio would also pull vaudeville stars away from the theater in the 1920s. Movies took audiences away. Vaudeville was dead by the end of the 1930s. I will give you a list of some people you might have heard of that came out of vaudeville. A comedian named Al Jolson. He and his brother were a comic team. He went to Broadway in the early 19-teens and became a star. The Marx Brothers, W.C. Fields, well, Jack Benny, Henny Youngman, Milton Berle. That's it. It was very, very difficult for a vaudeville performer to become a huge star. There was also George Burns as well, just a handful. At the height of vaudeville, there were 40,000 performers. Maybe 15 or 20 made the big time. Any questions, any comments? It is